You think law there is kind? I am building walls around you. Look up at me.
It was a dark, gloomy afternoon in the heart of Lagos, Nigeria. The sky was heavily laden with thick, black rain clouds that seemed to mirror the unspoken sorrow trapped inside a weathered, double-story concrete house standing at the corner of a quiet street. Inside the dimly lit living room of this house, an old man named Kwame sat in absolute stillness. To the outside world, he was a pillar of unyielding strength and rigid military-like discipline, a man who never allowed a single emotion to crack his stone-cold face. With slow, deliberate movements, his large, rough hands unfolded the morning newspaper. The sharp, crisp sound of paper tearing through the quiet air was the only sound that regularly echoed within those lonely, suffocating walls. From the cold, dark shadows of the long hallway, a young 10-year-old boy named Kofi stood completely frozen. He was clutching a colorful school drawing tightly against his chest, his tiny heart pounding violently with a deep, innocent hope of gaining his father's validation. Every single step the little boy took felt like walking on a field of shattered glass. He slowly forced his small, bare feet to move forward across the creaking floorboards, nervously approaching the unmovable mountain that was his father. With a trembling breath that visibly shook his tiny shoulders, Kofi extended his hands. He proudly offered a colorful crayon drawing of a father and son standing together hand in hand under a bright, smiling yellow sun. Kwame lowered the paper by just an inch, his sharp, analytical eyes glancing down through the silver frames of his reading glasses. He looked at the child's raw artwork for less than a single passing second. Without a single word of appreciation, and without even a gentle nod of recognition, the father placed the drawing flat on the dusty wooden side table. It was as if his son's effort meant absolutely nothing to him. Then came that voice, deep, heavy, and completely barren of any parental affection. The narrator could hear the absolute coldness as Kwame spoke, telling the young boy to return to his room because his school books and upcoming exams were waiting for him. Kofi turned around, his fragile world shattering into 1,000 painful pieces. He ran back through the dark hallway, the heavy sound of his desperate sobbing echoing off the silent, grey concrete walls of the house. The heavy wooden door of the bedroom slammed shut, cutting off the young boy from the rest of the silent house. Kofi threw himself face down onto his small, single bed, burying his face deeply into the rough cotton pillow, as the hot tears finally broke free, soaking through the fabric in the quiet dark. Outside, the skies finally opened up, and a brutal tropical downpour began to lash against the glass window pane. The young boy slowly rolled over, his tear-streaked face illuminated by the cold blue light of the storm, as he watched the water droplets slide down the glass like endless tears. Remembering his father's strict, unyielding command, Kofi wiped his wet eyes with the back of his trembling hand. He dragged himself toward his small wooden study desk, opening a thick, intimidating mathematics textbook, whose complicated numbers offered absolutely no comfort to his aching heart. Meanwhile, back in the quiet downstairs living space, the narrator could see the old man Kwame standing by the kitchen counter. His movements were slow, rhythmic, and completely calculated as he poured hot water into a ceramic mug, his face still as rigid and cold as a statue carved from dark stone. On the wall just above the kitchen table hung a dusty, framed photograph of a beautiful, smiling African woman, Kofi's late mother. Kwame's eyes shifted toward the frame for a brief, fleeting second, a shadow of profound pain passing through his gaze before he quickly locked his emotions away once more. When night finally fell over Lagos, the dinner table became a battlefield of absolute silence. Father and son sat opposite each other, the only sound being the metallic clinking of spoons against ceramic bowls as they ate their traditional jollof rice without exchanging a single word or a single glance. The moment the meal was finished, Kwame stood up rigidly, lifting his plate and walking directly toward the sink. He did not ask how his son's day was, nor did he acknowledge the heavy, suffocating sadness that filled the young boy's wide, expressive eyes. Days bled into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months inevitably hardened into long, painful years. The narrator observes that inside this house, nothing ever truly changed. The wall of silence between the father, who could not speak love, and the son, who despaired of hearing it, only grew taller and more unbreakable. 10 years passed by like a silent wind, and the small, frightened boy transformed into a brilliant, tall, and athletic young man of 23. Yet, despite his growth and his incredible academic achievements, the deep, unhealed wound in Kofi's heart remained exactly the same as it was in his childhood. On a bright, humid morning, a heavy white envelope arrived at the doorstep. The narrator notes the trembling of Kofi's fingers as he sliced the envelope open, revealing a formal letter that carried the prestigious seal of a top international university, offering him a fully funded master's degree scholarship. With his heart hammering against his ribs, just like it did when he was a little child, Kofi walked into the living room where his father sat in the exact same armchair. He held out the official acceptance letter, hoping that this monumental success would finally break the old man's icy exterior. Kwame adjusted his silver reading glasses, his large hands taking the paper from his son's grip. The narrator observes the agonizing seconds ticking away on the wall clock as the father slowly read through the glorious letter from beginning to end without a single muscle moving on his face. He lowered the paper, placed it down gently on the arm of his wooden chair, and looked up at his grown son. There was no warm embrace, no tears of fatherly pride, and no words of celebration. He simply said, "Good. Go and pack your bags. Do not waste this opportunity." An overwhelming wave of bitter anger and deep resentment washed over Kofi as he returned to his room. He grabbed an old leather suitcase from the top of the wardrobe and began throwing his clothes inside, his movements violent and fueled by years of accumulated emotional neglect. As he zipped the heavy bag closed, Kofi looked around the small bedroom that had been his only sanctuary during his painful childhood. The narrator realizes that at this very moment, the young man made a silent, burning vow to himself. He would leave this house, cross the ocean, and never return to this mountain of ice. The taxi ride to the international airport was wrapped in the same suffocating silence that had defined their entire lives together. Kwame sat in the passenger seat, staring straight at the crowded roads of Lagos, while Kofi stared out of the rear window, the distance between them feeling wider than the Atlantic Ocean. At the crowded, noisy departure terminal, Kofi pulled his suitcase close and finally turned to face the man who had raised him. He desperately waited for a crack in the armor, a single tear, a trembling hand, or a simple "I am proud of you, my son." But the old soldier stood perfectly still. Instead of an affectionate hug, Kwame slowly extended his right hand for a cold, formal handshake. His voice was steady and hard as iron as he told his son to take care of his health and always stay focused on his studies. Kofi gripped his father's rough hand for a brief fraction of a second, turned around sharply on his heel, and walked straight through the security gates. He kept his eyes locked firmly ahead, refusing to look back, completely unaware that behind him, his father's eyes followed his every step until he disappeared. With a deafening roar that shook the very air, the massive silver airplane lifted off from the runway, piercing through the thick grey clouds of Lagos. As the city below shrank into tiny dots, Kofi felt a profound sense of absolute freedom mixed with a bitter, hollow ache that refused to leave him. Thousands of miles away, a completely new world welcomed the young scholar. The narrator describes the stark contrast as Kofi walked down the icy, snow-covered streets of a European university town, wrapped tightly in a thick dark coat, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and a cold, biting wind. His new home was a tiny, minimalist university dorm room. It was warm and quiet, but as Kofi sat on the edge of his new bed, looking out at the unfamiliar snowy landscape, the deep silence of the room reminded him heavily of the concrete walls he had left behind in Lagos. Every single Sunday evening, a regular routine played out over the phone lines across continents. The call lasted for less than 2 minutes. Kwame's voice would crackle through the speaker, asking short, mechanical questions about his son's finances, health, and grades, never once asking about his happiness. Fueled by a desperate desire to prove his worth, Kofi buried himself completely in his research. He spent long, sleepless nights inside the vast university library, turning pages under the dim green lamps, determined to achieve a level of success that his father could simply never ignore. 2 years of relentless hard work culminated in a grand graduation ceremony. The narrator watches as Kofi stood proudly on the grand stage, wearing a black graduation gown and velvet cap, holding a first-class degree certificate, as a crowd of thousands cheered loudly around him. Later that night, standing alone in his room, Kofi took a high-quality photograph of his degree and sent it directly to his father via a message. He stared at the screen, watching the 2 small check marks turn blue, indicating that the old man in Lagos had seen his ultimate triumph. Kofi waited, his breath caught in his throat as the screen indicated his father was typing. Minutes felt like agonizing hours until finally, a notification popped up. It was a brief, devastating 2-word reply from Kwame, "Well done." Nothing more, nothing less. Deeply hurt and completely done with begging for affection, Kofi locked his heart tightly. Over the next few years, he climbed the corporate ladder with a ferocious intensity, securing a high-paying executive job at a prestigious firm, surrounding himself with luxury, but remaining utterly hollow inside. Years rolled past like waves on a silent shore, and by the age of 28, Kofi possessed everything a young man could ever dream of. His hard work had earned him a gorgeous, high-end apartment in the upper-class district of the city, complete with marble floors and expensive designer furniture. Yet, as the narrator observes, the massive rooms felt completely empty, lacking the warmth of a true home. Every evening after leaving his high-powered corporate job, he would pour himself a drink and stand by the massive glass balcony, watching the city lights blink like tiny, cold diamonds. He had successfully built a fortress of wealth around himself, but deep down, the ghost of that 10-year-old boy holding a rejected crayon drawing still lived quietly inside his chest. Then came a fateful Friday night that changed everything forever. Kofi was sitting at his study desk when his smartphone began to vibrate aggressively across the polished wood. The screen did not show his father's name, but rather a long, international number from Nigeria, breaking the quiet air with an ominous urgency. He answered the call with a hesitant greeting, only to hear the panicked, tearful voice of his maternal aunt from Lagos. The narrator notes that within 5 seconds, the corporate executive's world came to a sudden, crashing halt as her words cut through the line. "Kofi, come home quickly, your father has suffered a massive stroke, and the doctors say he does not have much time left." A chaotic blur of panic took over his body. Kofi threw his clothes into a suitcase without folding them, his hands trembling violently as a storm of conflicting emotions raged inside his head. He was angry, he was terrified, and he was deeply broken, realized that he might lose the man he spent his whole life trying to please. Within 3 hours, Kofi was sitting inside an international airplane, listening to the roaring engines as the aircraft cut through the dark night sky. He stared out into the pitch-black void, feeling as though he was traveling backward through time, heading straight back into the cold cage of silence he thought he had escaped forever. The journey ended not at the old concrete house, but inside the sterile, white walls of a crowded public hospital in Lagos. The narrator describes the heavy smell of antiseptics and the rhythmic, hollow ticking of medical monitors that greeted Kofi as he slowly pushed open the heavy door of room 402. When Kofi's eyes landed on the bed, his heart shattered completely. The man lying there did not look like the terrifying, unmovable mountain from his childhood. Kwame looked shockingly small, his once strong frame completely withered, his skin pale, and his breathing supported by a plastic oxygen mask. With heavy, dragging steps, Kofi walked over and sat down on a cold iron chair beside the bed. He looked at his father's face, searching for that old, terrifying look of strict authority, but found only the deep, painful lines of an old man fighting a losing battle against death. For the first time in his adult life, Kofi reached out his hand and gently touched his father's wrinkled, large hand resting on the white sheet. The narrator notes that the rough skin, which once held newspapers with such hard authority, now felt shockingly cold, thin, and entirely defenseless. As if feeling the warmth of his son's touch, the old man's eyelids fluttered weakly. Kwame slowly opened his eyes, his vision cloudy and unfocused, turning his head by a fraction of an inch until his gaze finally locked onto the face of the son, who had traveled across the ocean to find him. He pulled down the plastic oxygen mask with a trembling, weak effort, his dry lips parting as he tried to speak. Kofi leaned in closer, his heart stopping as his father whispered in a broken, raspy voice, "Kofi, you came, go to the house, the key, bottom drawer, look at the black book." Before Kofi could ask a single question, Kwame's strength completely faded. His eyes closed slowly, his hand slipping limply out of his son's grip as he fell back into a deep, unconscious sleep, leaving the young man standing in a state of absolute confusion and mystery. Leaving his aunt to watch over his father, Kofi walked out of the hospital and took a taxi back to the old house in Lagos. The narrator describes the heavy feeling in the air as Kofi unlocked the creaking front door, stepping inside the dark, dusty living room where the silence felt heavier than a mountain of stone. He walked directly toward his father's private study room, a place he was strictly forbidden from entering during his childhood. His shoes made heavy sounds against the floorboards as he approached the large, dark oak wooden desk that sat under a dusty window covered in spider webs. Kofi knelt down on the cold floor, his heart thumping loudly inside his throat as he reached for the metal handle of the bottom drawer. With a loud, rusty screeching sound, the heavy wooden drawer slid open, revealing a hidden compartment covered under old receipts and bank documents. Deep beneath the mountain of worthless papers lay a heavy, thick book bound in worn-out black leather. Kofi's hands trembled as he pulled it out. The leather was scratched and fading, its pages thick and yellowed with time. This was his father's private diary, a secret world hidden for decades. Kofi pulled out the heavy wooden chair, the loud scraping sound against the floorboards breaking the heavy silence of the room. He sat down at the very desk where his father had spent decades shutting the world out, holding the worn black leather diary in his lap, his breath catching in his throat as he prepared to open the forbidden book. With trembling fingers, he slowly lifted the heavy black cover. A faint scent of old paper and fading ink drifted into the air as the first page flipped open, revealing rows of neat, tightly written handwriting that belonged unmistakably to Kwame, a diary that began on the very day Kofi was born. The narrator notes that the very first entry was dated 28 years ago. Kofi's eyes scanned the words as his father wrote, "Today, God gave me a son. When I held his tiny, fragile body in my large, rough hands, my heart melted completely. I looked into his big brown eyes and promised myself I would protect him from the harshness of this brutal world, no matter what cost. As he turned the pages, the tone of the diary shifted into deep, unimaginable sorrow. An entry from 10 years later detailed the exact night Kofi's mother passed away, where Kwame wrote, "My beautiful wife is gone, and I am left entirely alone to raise our boy. I am drowning in pain, but I must never let Kofi see my tears. If I break down, he will break down. I must become an unbreakable wall of stone for him." Then, Kofi reached an entry that made his breath completely stop. It was the exact date of the afternoon he had brought his crayon drawing to the living room. Kwame's words read, "Today, my sweet Kofi brought me a beautiful drawing of us standing together under the sun. My heart wept with joy, and I wanted nothing more than to pull him into a tight embrace and tell him how much I love him." The entry continued with an agonizing truth, but I had to stop myself. The world outside is cruel to young, emotional African boys. If I make him soft, the world will tear him apart. I must teach him discipline and strength. When I put the drawing on the side table, it broke my soul. But I did it to make him a warrior. Kofi lifted the faded crayon drawing with both hands, pressing it against his trembling lips as the dam finally broke. The narrator observes that the heavy corporate executive, who had hardened his heart against the world, was now crying like a helpless child, realizing that his father's coldness was nothing but a shield of desperate love. He read through the remaining pages in a desperate frenzy. Every single exam score he had achieved, every trophy he had won, and every corporate promotion he had received was meticulously recorded in the diary. Kwame had saved every newspaper cutting of his son's achievements, celebrating every victory in the absolute secrecy of this dark room. On the very page detailing his university graduation, Kwame had written, "Today, my son became a graduate." He sent me a photo of his degree. I typed "well done" because my hands were shaking so much with tears of pride that I could not type anything else. I wanted to write 1,000 words, but I feared my weakness would hold him back from soaring higher. Closing the diary tightly and clutching it against his ribs, Kofi stood up with sudden, fierce determination. He ran out of the quiet concrete house, slamming the front door shut, as he sprinted into the humid Lagos afternoon air, desperate to reach the hospital before the silence became permanent. The afternoon heat of Lagos was suffocating. Kofi pushed his body to its absolute limits, dodging through the chaotic market stalls. Honking horns and shouting voices blurred into a loud hum. He leaped past the famous yellow buses, his hand gripping the diary tightly. He burst through the hospital's glass double doors. The sudden cool, sterile air hit his sweaty face like a physical wall. Shouting nurses tried to call him back, but Kofi ignored everyone, his eyes locked entirely on the overhead signs. The endless corridor stretched out before him, a long maze of closed white doors and blinking lights. He suddenly stopped outside room 402, his breathing heavy, as his hands gripped the cold frame of the door. Inside, the scene was filled with quiet, tense chaos. Doctors and nurses surrounded the bed, adjusting glowing red monitors. The head doctor slowly lowered his clipboard, turning around with a gaze full of profound pity and exhaustion. Through the gap between the doctors, Kofi finally saw him, his unbreakable father looking incredibly small and weak. Kofi's legs completely gave out. He collapsed onto his knees, dropping the heavy diary onto the mattress. Kofi looked up at the digital screen. The bright green vital lines were fluctuating wildly, dropping lower with every passing second. Kwame's fingers twitched weakly on the sheet. With the last bit of his strength, he wrapped them around Kofi's hand. At the sound of his son's breathing, the old soldier fought his final battle. Kwame's heavy eyelids trembled open one last time. Kofi lifted the black leather journal with trembling hands. Tears streamed down his face as he pressed it tightly against his ribs. His voice shook violently, filled with years of hidden pain. "Papa, I read it all. I know how much you loved me. I know the truth." For the first time in his entire life, Kwame let out a tear. The unyielding wall of stone was completely gone. His eyelids closed gently for the last time. The long, agonizing silence of their relationship had finally been broken. A continuous, sharp flatline sound filled the small space, announcing that the unmovable mountain of stone had finally fallen. The high-pitched noise faded into a dull ring in Kofi's ears. He stared blankly ahead, his world losing all of its color. The corporate executive was gone. Only a helpless child remained, weeping silently against the cold iron of the bed. The chief doctor walked over slowly. He placed a gentle, comforting hand on Kofi's trembling shoulder. With a heavy, silent sigh, the nurse stepped forward and slowly pulled the white sheet over Kwame's face. Kofi stood up slowly, his knees shaking. The room felt completely empty now, filled only with a freezing silence. He looked down at the bed. His fingers reached out and firmly gripped the old black leather diary once more. He turned away from the bed, walking out of room 402 with slow, heavy steps that echoed down the hallway. He stopped by a large glass window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass, looking out at the city. Outside, the golden sun was dipping below the horizon, burying Lagos in deep orange and purple shadows. Kofi looked down at the black book in his hands. The silence between them was gone, replaced by a lasting legacy. He pulled the worn journal close to his chest. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was his father's heart. With a deep breath, he turned away from the glass window. He began his slow walk down the long corridor. The elevator button glowed with a faint white light. He stood there, waiting in the absolute stillness. The elevator doors slid open into the main lobby. The chaotic sounds of the world rushed back in. He stepped out of the building. The cool night air of the city swept across his face. He walked across the dark, silent parking lot, his car keys clicking softly in the night. The car door unlocked with a sharp beep. He pulled it open, ready to face the long drive home. He sat heavily into the driver's seat, resting the precious diary safely on the passenger side. He pushed the start button. The dashboard screens woke up instantly, lighting up his quiet face. The car moved smoothly out of the clinic gate, merging into the heavy, bright flow of the night traffic. Rhythmic beams of golden streetlights flashed across the dark interior, dancing over his silent features. He briefly looked down to his right side. The heavy black book rested peacefully on the leather seat. While keeping his eyes firmly on the dark road, his hand reached out to gently touch the worn leather. A soft, gentle drizzle began to fall, tiny water droplets scattering the bright city lights across the glass. The wipers cleared the water with a low, rhythmic sweep, bringing back a clear view of the endless path ahead. In the quiet hum of the moving car, Kofi smiled faintly, finally letting go of the heavy anger he had carried for years. The car pulled up to the old iron gates. The house stood dark, wrapped in a heavy, unfamiliar silence. He walked up the concrete steps, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the empty porch. The metallic click of the key felt loud, breaking a silence that had lasted for weeks. He pushed the door open. The familiar scent of old books and polish welcomed him into the dark hallway. A single flick of the switch brought a pale, warm glow over the dust-covered furniture. There sat his father's favorite chair, empty, yet still holding the heavy weight of his presence. Kofi walked past the living room, his eyes fixed on the half-open door of his father's private study. He gently pushed the door. This room was the sanctuary of Chief Kwame, the place where secrets lived. He stepped into the heart of the room, his eyes scanning the massive mahogany desk covered in old documents. Kofi reached out and clicked the vintage desk lamp. A warm, emerald green glow flooded the workspace. There they lay, his father's silver reading glasses, resting exactly where he had left them. He pulled out the heavy leather chair. The loud scraping sound broke the heavy silence of the house. He sat down carefully, placing the worn black leather diary right into the center of the warm light. With a heavy heart, he opened the book. He turned past the old entries, seeking the final words. He stopped at the final page. The handwriting here was different, shaky, weak, and written in a hurry. As his eyes scanned the trembling lines, Kofi's breath caught completely in his throat. The shaky words read, "My dear Kofi, if you are reading this, my voice has already failed me. I know you think I am a mountain of ice, but my harshness was only a shield to protect you from a ruthless corporate world. I chose to let you hate me, as long as it kept you strong enough to survive when I am gone." The wall of bitterness crumbled completely. The heavy burden of years of anger turned into pure, weeping sorrow. He gripped the solid wood of his father's desk, finally understanding the heavy price of a protector's love. With a trembling hand, he reached out and held the silver glasses close to his heart. Outside, the rain had stopped. A vast sky of stars opened up over the sleeping city, peaceful and calm. He gently closed the heavy leather cover. The long, exhausting night of shadows was finally over. The heavy darkness of the night slowly melted away, giving path to a brilliant, golden dawn. Warm morning sunlight cut through the open wooden blinds, washing the old study room in gold. Kofi stood up, unzipping the heavy dark jacket. It was time to leave the shadows behind. He dressed in his father's favorite colors, wearing the traditional green and white patterns of his people. He carefully placed the old black diary inside his leather bag, a sacred treasure he would carry forever. And next to his heart, he kept his father's silver reading glasses, a reminder of the eyes that watched over him. With a strong posture and a clear mind, Kofi stepped out of the old house, facing the bright world outside. He didn't just inherit a name, he inherited a mission to protect and build the legacy his father left behind. For the first time in his life, Kofi looked up at the open sky and felt completely safe, knowing his father's cold armor was made entirely of pure love. A father's strictness is often a shield that bears the heat of the sun, just so his child can grow safely in the shade. When we finally understand the shield, the protector is often gone.